All right, my name is Levi Hawes. This is my research presentation about how poverty affects adolescents. In 2014, there was a study done that found that about 15 million children in the United States, which is about 21% of all children, live in families with incomes lower than the federal poverty threshold. That's a lot of children and adolescents that are affected, and it can hamper their development as members of society, as students, and it can affect them into adulthood. The five aspects five aspects of development that are affected by poverty that I focused my research on are emotional development, social development, physical health, education, and the sexual activity of adolescents. So the first topic that I looked at was emotional development. Poverty can cause anxiety among adolescents, making them feel pressure from the financial restrictions that are placed upon their families. Their self-esteem can be affected. They often suffer from depression, low self-esteem, and a sense of powerlessness when compared to their peers from higher income households. So they often compare themselves to their more affluent peers. And they can often experience a lot of stress, which can lead to aggression, isolation, deviance, etc. And I'll focus on stress and some different aspects of that a little later on. So some social development that is affected by adolescence or by poverty. The neighborhood in which adolescents grow up in is usually affected by the income, as the lower income households will live in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. I have a quote here from some of the research that I did. It says, high poverty neighborhoods have lower availability of high quality public and private services, as well as fewer social supports and less effective social networks. Low income, high poverty areas usually are higher in delinquency. There's a correlation between high poverty neighborhoods and high crime rates, street violence, and availability of illegal drugs. And poverty can also lead to less social time spent with friends, which can hamper an adolescent's ability to maintain friendships, because a lot of them feel that they can't participate in the things that their friends do because they don't have enough funds to do the same things, like going to movies or whatever it may be. Just a little bit more on how social development is effective. I already touched on this a little bit, but they have difficulty maintaining their friendships and their relationships, and a lot of times it's because their families have to relocate a lot based on their housing situation, so they may move a lot, which doesn't allow them to maintain long friendships. This can disrupt their social interactions in school as well as in their communities and their neighborhoods. And although these things may seem trivial to us, they can, in the long term, cause larger social and emotional issues amongst adolescents and into their adult years. Physical health is also affected by high poverty. Sometimes adolescents they have no access to highly nutritious foods because of work schedules of their parents or what have you, and so they're less likely to eat a nutritious diet. Going back to what I said about parental work schedules, a lot of times there's no parents around to monitor the eating habits of their children and their adolescents, and so that in turn affects their diet. And sometimes, depending on where the parents work, they don't have good access to healthcare and insurance, which can lead to worse healthcare as they get older. I have a quote here that says, Low income on one hand and reduced access to healthcare and worse health on the other represents just one manifestation of the effect of socioeconomic status on the life chances of adolescents. This allostatic load. The amount of work the body goes through to adapt to stress is referred to as allostatic load. I mentioned earlier that I would return to stress. The higher the allostatic load, the bigger impact on an individual's overall health. I have a quote that says, "Youths raised in neighborhoods with lower median incomes and higher unemployment and poverty rates showed higher degrees of allostatic load into adulthood." So, like I mentioned before, a lot of these effects from poverty can lead to later effects in their lives as they become adults. And this allostatic load and the stress that comes from it is one of the bigger factors that can affect them into adulthood. Education. I'll be covering kind of two main points about education. One being how staying in school as an adolescent. A lot of adolescents feel forced to drop out of school to help contribute with their family income, their household income, or by looking after their younger siblings. Chronic stress can make it difficult for teens to excel in school because it can impair their attention and their concentration, which will lead to worse grades. And the stress comes from the poverty, obviously. The lack of success in academics or spending time with peers who are also dropouts can influence students who don't have great academic support at home. That can go back to the social aspect of their neighborhoods, of who they hang around, and it's usually their peers who also struggle with academics. The second point in education that I want to discuss is the quality of their education. I have a quote here that says, "Due to residential stratification and segregation, low-income students usually attend schools with lower funding levels, which result in reduced availability of textbooks and other instructional materials, laboratory equipment, library books, and other educational resources." These types of characteristics in schools, combined with low parental involvement at home, can have a severe impact on a student's education. The final point that I'll be discussing is how an adolescent's sexual activity is influenced by their level of poverty. In low-income families, adolescents are reported as having their first sexual experience at the average age of 12. Recent research has found that 13% of girls and 15% of boys have had sex by the time that they are 16. That's a really young age to begin having sexual experiences, and it is greatly affected by poverty. Poverty linked to teenage pregnancy is another point that I'd like to discuss. In the United States, the states with highest percentage of teens living in poverty also have the highest proportion of births to unwed teen mothers. This can lead to a difficult breaking of the poverty cycle, because if a teenager who grew up in poverty has a child, that usually has further economic stresses upon her and her family, which can make it more difficult for them to break the cycle of poverty. I have a quote here: "Children who reported high levels of parental monitoring were less likely to report initiating sex in pre-adolescence and reported lower rates of sexual initiation as they aged." So we can see a correlation between the amount of time that adolescents spend at home alone, unsupervised, and their more risky sexual activity, leading to more pregnancies, higher rates of STDs, and so on. But when there's more supervised activity going on in the home, those rates drop. So in conclusion, just to go back and go over the points again, I discussed how poverty can affect the emotional development of adolescents, social development, their physical health, education, and their sexual activity. Through this research, I hope to learn and continue to learn about other aspects of adolescents' life that can affect them in these ways. As a future high school teacher, I hope to be able to learn more about my students and help them in any areas that they may be struggling in.